The great hall of the assembly core had never been this quiet. Thousands of seats rose in wide circles around an open floor, and every seat was filled. Beings with scales, feathers, shifting skin, and glowing eyes sat side by side, all watching the same spot. A soft chime rang through the chamber, and the lights dimmed just enough to make the center floor glow brighter than the rest of the room. At the center of that floor stood one small, ordinary-looking woman. She had brown hair pulled back, tired eyes, and hands folded behind her back. Her name was Grace Holloway, and today she was the only human in a room built to hold thousands. For months, the assembly had argued about what to do with humanity. Some species said humans broke too many rules. Others said humans grew too fast, built too many ships, and asked too many questions no one wanted answered. A few said humans were simply too dangerous to trust, even if they had never truly attacked anyone first. Counselor Ren Aldis stood at the high platform above the floor, his long robes catching the light. He was proud, and everyone in the hall knew it. He had spent years building support for this exact moment. Humanity has done nothing wrong that we can prove, he said, his voice carrying easily through the hall. But that is exactly the problem. We do not know what they will do next. No one does. Not even them. A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Grace did not flinch. She had heard worse. The assembly was built on trust, Ren continued. Trust between species who understand each other. We understand the Caveran. We understand the Sovi. We do not understand humans, and a species we cannot understand is a species we cannot plan around. He raised a hand, and behind him a massive board of lights appeared, one light for every representative in the hall. I call for the final vote. Should humanity remain a member of this assembly, yes or no? The lights began to change, one by one, red for no, blue for yes. Grace watched them turn red across the board, faster than she expected. Red lights spread like a spreading stain, species after species choosing the same answer. By the time the board stopped flashing, more than 9 out of every 10 lights burned red. The hall erupted into noise, some cheering, some murmuring, a few staying silent. Ren raised his hands for quiet, and slowly the noise faded. The vote is decided, he said. Humanity is no longer a member of this assembly. You have one galactic cycle to withdraw all ships, all colonies, all citizens from assembly space. He looked down at Grace, almost expecting her to argue, to beg for more time, to threaten something. Instead, she simply nodded once. We understand, she said. Her voice was calm, steady, without anger. We will be gone before your cycle ends. A few representatives exchanged surprised looks. They had expected resistance. Grace turned and walked off the floor without another word, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. News of the vote spread across every world within hours. Humanity did not argue. They did not send warnings or threats. Ships that had been parked near assembly worlds for trade simply turned and left. Colonies packed their belongings and boarded transports without protest. Within days, human presence in assembly space had already begun shrinking, and by the end of the cycle, it had vanished completely. Not everyone was happy about it, even among those who voted yes. Ambassador Leora Doran, a diplomat from the Caveran Assembly, watched the human ships leave from a viewing deck above one of the trade stations. She had voted yes, following her government's wishes, but something about the silence bothered her. They didn't even try to stay, she said quietly to the officer beside her. Would you want them to? The officer asked. Leora didn't answer right away. She had worked with humans before, on trade routes and joint patrols. She remembered how quickly they solved problems no one else could solve, how they never seemed to give up on something once they started it. A species like that simply walking away, without a fight, without so much as a formal protest, did not sit right with her. A species that gives up that easily, she finally said, either never cared, or already has somewhere else to go. The officer laughed off the comment, but Leora kept watching the last human transport ship until it vanished into the dark. Across assembly space, the celebrations began almost immediately. Worlds that had once worried about human power now threw festivals in the streets. Statues of past conflicts involving humans were melted down and reshaped into monuments of peace. New holidays were declared to mark the day the assembly finally became, as many put it, safe again. Songs were written about the peace that would now last forever, now that the unpredictable species was gone. Counselor Reynolds stood on a balcony overlooking one such celebration weeks later, watching fireworks bloom over a city that had once feared human warships passing through its system. He allowed himself a rare smile. "We did the right thing," he told an aide standing beside him. "The galaxy is safer without them." The aide nodded in agreement, and somewhere far below, the crowd cheered louder as another firework lit up the sky. None of them knew that humanity had not disappeared at all. Somewhere far beyond the edges of mapped space, past old trade routes no one used anymore, human ships were already gathering in a hidden nebula few had ever charted. They were not running from the galaxy. They were simply choosing, for now, to be somewhere the galaxy could not see them. And they were building something. Deep inside a nebula that appeared on no assembly star chart, thick clouds of colored gas glowed faintly around a cluster of hidden shipyards. From a distance, the nebula looked like nothing more than dust and light, the kind of place ships avoided because sensors could not see clearly through it. That was exactly why humanity had chosen it. Inside one of the colony domes built along a rocky moon within the nebula, a group of children sat in a circle on the floor, listening to an old man tell a story they had heard many times before but never grew tired of. The old man's name was Simeon Voss. His hair was fully white now, his hands wrinkled and slow, but his voice still carried the strength of someone who had lived through more than most people ever would. He was the last person alive who remembered Earth before the withdrawal. "Tell us about the vote again," one of the children asked, a boy no older than 8, sitting cross-legged near the front. Simeon smiled the way he always did before this particular story. "The assembly voted us out," he said. "Every species raised their hand against us, all except a handful who stayed quiet. They said we were too unpredictable, too fast, too much of everything they didn't understand." "Were we angry?" a girl asked. "Some of us were," Simeon admitted. "But Admiral Holloway said something I never forgot. She said, if they don't want us at their table, we'll build our own." Among the children sat a boy a little older than the rest, quiet, watching everything closely instead of asking questions like the younger ones. His name was Daniel Osei, and unlike most of the children in that circle, he had already begun training in the engineering bays 3 mornings a week. He didn't need convincing that this story was true. He had seen the shipyards with his own eyes. Years passed the way they always do, quietly and without asking permission. Daniel grew from a curious boy into a serious young man, spending long hours inside the training halls learning combat tactics, ship systems, and the long, complicated history of a species that had chosen to disappear rather than shrink itself to fit somewhere it wasn't wanted. The cradle, as the hidden colony had come to be called, grew busier every year. What had started as a handful of shipyards became a small fleet, then a larger one, hidden entirely from assembly space. Every ship built there followed a single purpose, decided decades earlier by Admiral Grace Holloway herself. This fleet was never meant to conquer anything. It was meant to answer a call, if one ever came, and to make sure humanity was never again forced out of anywhere simply because it made others uncomfortable. Out in assembly space, decades had reshaped everything. New trade agreements linked dozens of species together. New leaders rose who had never even met a human, let alone fought beside or against one. Stories about humanity slowly drifted from history into legend. Counselor Reynolds, older now but still respected, often used humanity's disappearance as proof that his decades-old decision had been correct. "Look how peaceful things have become," he liked to say during assembly meetings. "We removed one unstable piece, and the whole board became stable." Not everyone agreed with him. Ambassador Leora Doran, though older and more senior in her own government now, still remembered the human transport ships leaving without protest all those years ago. She had never fully accepted the idea that a species like that had simply vanished into nothing. From time to time, she quietly checked old trade logs and border reports, searching for anything unusual near the outer edges of mapped space. She never found proof of anything, but she never stopped looking either. Back at the cradle, Daniel Osei stood one evening on an observation platform overlooking the shipyards, watching new hull frames being lowered into place by machines that never seemed to stop working. Beside him stood Admiral Grace Holloway, older now, her hair fully gray, but her eyes just as sharp as they had been on the day of the vote. "Do you think they still talk about us out there?" Daniel asked. "They talk about a version of us," Grace said. "Not who we actually are. People always remember what's convenient, not what's true. Do you think we'll ever go back?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, watching the shipyard lights reflect off the nebula's colored gas. "Only if they need us," she said finally. "We didn't build all this to prove a point. We built it in case the day comes when the galaxy can't fix its own problems anymore." Daniel didn't fully understand what she meant, not yet. He assumed that day, if it ever came, was still far away, something for a future generation to deal with rather than his own. He had no way of knowing that hundreds of light years away, on the far edge of assembly territory, a new power was already rising, one that had no interest in peace, no memory of humanity as a warning, and no hesitation about taking whatever it wanted from a galaxy that had grown soft and unprepared during a century of quiet. The silence the assembly had celebrated for so long was about to end, and not in the way anyone expected. Smoke curled up from the ruins of a colony dome that had stood peacefully for over 60 years, until 3 days ago. Refugee ships rose from its cracked landing pads in ragged formation, engines straining under the weight of too many passengers, while behind them the sky above the colony lit up again and again with distant explosions. None of the people fleeing looked back. They already knew what they would see. This was the fifth world the Drovash Dominion had taken in the last 2 years, and each time, the pattern was the same. Warships would appear at the edge of a system without warning, demand surrender within a single day, and if that demand was refused, which it usually was, the bombing would begin before negotiations even finished. Warlord Gurek stood on the command deck of his flagship, watching the same colony burn on a wide view screen in front of him. He was tall even among his own kind, with dark-plated skin and eyes that never seemed to blink. He did not enjoy destruction for its own sake. He simply understood that fear worked faster than diplomacy, and the Dominion valued speed above almost everything else. "Casualties?" he asked without turning around. "Minimal on our side," an officer answered. The colony had almost no real defense fleet, just local patrol ships. Gurek nodded slowly. "That has been true of every world we've taken so far." The assembly grew comfortable. Comfortable species do not build strong militaries. They build committees. Far away, inside the assembly core, that comfort was rapidly turning into panic. Emergency sessions were called almost weekly now, filled with representatives arguing over resolutions that took too long to pass and defense plans that arrived too late to matter. Refugees from fallen worlds filled temporary shelters on a dozen different planets, and every week, the number of worlds under Dominion control grew larger. Ambassador Leora Doran stood before the full assembly, frustration clear in her voice as she addressed the crowded hall. "We have spent a century building trade agreements and cultural treaties," she said. "We have built almost nothing capable of stopping a real invasion. The Dominion does not care about our treaties. They care about how quickly we surrender." Counselor Ren Aldous, older now, his once proud posture slightly bent with age, rose from his seat to respond. "Our alliances have kept peace for 100 years, he said. "We simply need to strengthen diplomatic pressure, not rush into military panic." Diplomatic pressure didn't stop them from taking 5 worlds, Leora shot back. "How many more before you admit this isn't the same galaxy you built your peace plan for?" The hall fell into arguing voices, different species shouting over each other, none of them agreeing on a single plan. Leora left the session early, her frustration boiling beneath a calm exterior. Outside the chamber, she stood on a balcony overlooking the capital city, watching news broadcasts on a nearby public screen showing footage of the latest fallen colony. A younger aide approached her carefully. "Ambassador, there's word from the border patrols. Dominion scouts were spotted near Sector 11. That's close to old human space." Leora turned sharply. "Old human space hasn't been scouted in decades. There's nothing out there but empty systems and abandoned relay stations." "That's what everyone thought," the aide said. "But the scouts didn't come back with nothing. They found some kind of old signal tower still active. Dominion forces are moving to investigate it." Leora felt something tighten in her chest, a feeling she hadn't had in years. She remembered watching the last human transport ship disappear into the dark all those decades ago, and the quiet suspicion she had never fully let go of. Back on the front lines, a Dominion strike team moved cautiously through the wreckage of an old relay station, drifting silently at the edge of what used to be human territory. Dust and debris floated in the low gravity as soldiers searched through rusted corridors for anything valuable enough to salvage. One soldier pried open a sealed panel near the station's core, revealing a small device still glowing faintly with a soft blue light despite decades of neglect. He called his commander over immediately. "This thing's still powered," the soldier said, running a scanner over it. "After all this time, that shouldn't be possible." The commander studied the readings on the scanner's display, confusion crossing his face. "Some kind of automated relay. Looks dormant, but it's tied to a network we don't recognize." Neither soldier noticed the panel beneath the device shift slightly as internal systems, untouched for decades, quietly activated for the first time since they had been sealed away. A single signal, small and easy to miss, slipped outward into the dark, heading toward coordinates that existed on no Dominion star chart and no assembly record either. It traveled for hours through empty space, weaving past old debris fields and long abandoned trade lanes, until it finally reached the edge of a nebula few had ever charted correctly. There, hidden shipyards that had spent decades in silence suddenly lit up with new activity, alarms sounding softly through corridors that had grown used to routine and quiet. Admiral Grace Holloway received the alert while reviewing maintenance reports in her quarters. She read the signal's origin point twice before setting the report aside entirely. The Dominion had just found something they were never supposed to find, and without knowing it, they had woken something the galaxy had spent a century forgetting. Dust had settled over the cradle's main council chamber for years without anyone bothering to clean the highest shelves, since no one ever needed to reach them. That evening, someone finally did. A young technician climbed a ladder to pull down an old sealed case that hadn't been opened since the colony's earliest days, following an order that had come directly from Admiral Grace Holloway herself. Inside the chamber below, Grace stood at the center of a wide table covered in holographic star charts, watching a single red marker blink steadily near the edge of old human territory. Around her, senior officers and engineers had gathered quickly, pulled from their normal duties the moment the alert went out. "Confirm it again," Grace said. "I want to be certain before we act on this." An officer beside her adjusted the display. "Signal origin matches Relay Station 7, Sector 11. That beacon was sealed and left dormant 63 years ago. It was only ever supposed to activate under one condition: outside forces breaching old human territory with hostile intent." Grace finished quietly. She had written that condition herself, decades earlier, back when the cradle was still half-built and humanity's future was far less certain than it felt today. The technician arrived with the old sealed case and set it carefully on the table. Grace opened it herself, revealing a small data core that had been stored away since before most of the officers in the room were even born. She inserted it into the main display, and a recorded message flickered to life, showing a much younger version of herself standing in an empty shipyard. "If you're seeing this," the recording said, "it means the beacon activated. It means someone dangerous has found old human space, and they didn't come in peace. You already know what we built this fleet for. The question now is whether you're ready to use it." The message ended, and silence filled the chamber for a long moment. Captain Daniel Osei, now fully grown and serving as one of the fleet's senior officers, stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, watching the reaction of everyone around him. He had trained his entire life for a moment like this, yet somehow it still felt sudden now that it had actually arrived. "Admiral," he said, stepping forward, "the Dominion found that relay by accident. They don't know what it means yet, but they will figure out something's out here eventually. If we wait too long, we lose the advantage of surprise." Grace studied the star charts silently before answering. "If we move now, every ship, every soul on this fleet gets pulled into a war we didn't start." "With respect, Admiral," Daniel said, "the assembly might not survive long enough for us to decide on our own timeline. Refugee reports say the Dominion is taking a new world every few months. That pace isn't slowing down." Grace looked around the chamber at officers who had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this decision, born into a colony built for one single purpose. She thought of the vote decades earlier, of walking off that assembly floor without argument, promising herself that the next time humanity stepped into that galaxy, it would be entirely on their own terms. "We're not doing this for the assembly," she finally said. "We're doing it because if the Dominion succeeds now, whatever comes after them will eventually find this nebula too. There's no such thing as staying hidden forever." Meanwhile, far across the galaxy, Ambassador Leora Doran sat alone in her private office, replaying intercepted fragments of a strange signal her intelligence team had picked up near the same sector the Dominion scouts had been investigating. The signal was old, encoded in a format her analysts didn't recognize at first, until one junior officer cross-referenced it against a database, so old it had been archived and mostly forgotten. "Ambassador," the officer said, stepping into her office, "I think I know what this is. The encoding matches old human communication protocols. Pre-withdrawal formatting." Leora sat back slowly in her chair. "That's not possible. Human systems haven't been active in this galaxy for over 60 years. "That's what I thought too," the officer said. "But the match is almost perfect. Whatever sent this signal either learned to copy human technology exactly, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Leora stood and walked to the window overlooking the assembly capital, thinking back to the day she had watched the last human transport disappear into the dark, and the quiet suspicion she had carried with her every year since then. She had always believed a species that left that easily either never truly cared or already had somewhere else to be. Now, for the first time in decades, she allowed herself to consider a third possibility she had never fully spoken aloud. They hadn't left forever. They had simply been waiting. Back at the cradle, Grace Holloway gave the order that set the entire hidden fleet into motion for the first time since its founding. Engines that had spent decades running only diagnostic tests now roared to full power. Crews who had trained on simulations their entire lives took their positions on real warships for the very first time. Daniel Osei stood at his station aboard one of the fleet's lead vessels, watching the shipyard doors slowly open to reveal open space beyond the nebula for the first time in his life. Somewhere out there, a war was already being lost. Humanity was finally coming to decide whether it would stay that way. Explosions lit up the sky above the world of Castle Reach like a storm that refused to end. Dominion warships hung in orbit, firing down at the last remaining defense platforms with steady, unhurried precision. Warlord Guruk's forces had expected the world to fall within hours, the same way every other target had fallen before it. There was no reason to expect anything different this time. Down on the surface, the last defenders of Castle Reach held a single command bunker, watching their sensors light up with incoming Dominion landing craft. A young officer manning the communications station kept sending distress calls out into open space, knowing full well that no help was likely to arrive in time. "Any response from the assembly fleet?" his commander asked, not really expecting a good answer. "Nothing," the officer said. "Same as the last 3 worlds." Above them, Guruk stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the final assault unfold with the same calm patience he always carried into battle. "Send the landing craft in once orbital defenses are fully suppressed," he ordered. This world should be secured within the hour. That was the exact moment space itself seemed to tear open above the planet. A ripple of distorted light spread across the sky, and where there had been empty space seconds earlier, dozens of unfamiliar warships suddenly appeared, arranged in tight, disciplined formation directly above the Dominion fleet. Every sensor screen on every Dominion ship lit up at once with contact warnings. On the bridge of the lead human vessel, Admiral Grace Holloway watched the Dominion formation scramble to react, their shock plainly visible even through cold sensor readings alone. Beside her, Captain Daniel Osei gripped the edge of his station, his heart pounding with the mix of nerves and readiness that came from a lifetime of preparation finally meeting its moment. "Admiral, Dominion ships are repositioning," an officer reported. "They're trying to form a defensive line." "They're too slow," Grace said quietly. "Begin the engagement." Human warships moved with a speed and coordination the Dominion fleet had never encountered before. Weapons fire lanced across the battlefield in precise, overlapping patterns, striking exactly where Dominion shields were weakest before those shields could even finish adjusting. Ships that had conquered 5 worlds without serious resistance suddenly found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Guruk's confidence cracked for the first time in years as he watched 2 of his heaviest warships lose power within the first few minutes of the engagement. "Identify that fleet," he demanded. "Where did they come from?" "Unknown origin," an officer answered, voice tight with alarm. "Ship design doesn't match any registered assembly species. Weapons signatures don't match anything in our database either." "That's not possible," Guruk said. "Nothing appears from nowhere with a fleet this size." Down on the surface of Castle Reach, the defenders in the command bunker watched their sensor readouts in stunned silence as Dominion ships began breaking formation and retreating under heavy fire. The young communications officer stared at his screen, unable to process what he was seeing. "Sir," he said slowly, "I'm picking up an open transmission from the new fleet. They're broadcasting on old emergency frequencies. Frequencies we haven't used in decades." "Play it," his commander said. A calm, steady voice filled the bunker, carrying no anger, no excitement, just quiet certainty. "This is Admiral Grace Holloway of the human fleet. We received your distress signal. Hold your position. Help has arrived." The bunker fell into stunned silence. Somewhere among the older officers present, a few exchanged disbelieving glances, remembering stories about a species that had vanished from the galaxy before most of them had even been born. Above the planet, the battle continued for nearly 2 hours, though it never came close to matching the length of Guruk's previous conquests. Human ships moved with practiced precision, disabling Dominion vessels rather than destroying them outright whenever possible, focusing on breaking the enemy's ability to fight rather than simply causing destruction. Daniel Osei found himself issuing orders with a confidence he hadn't fully expected from himself. Years of simulated training finally proving its worth in ways no simulation could ever fully capture. By the time Guruk gave the order to retreat, more than half his attacking fleet had been disabled or destroyed. He stood on his bridge, watching the wreckage of his warships drift silently in the dark, forced to accept a defeat unlike anything the Dominion had experienced in years. "Pull back," he said finally, his voice heavy with restrained anger. "Full retreat. We regroup and reassess." As the remaining Dominion ships jumped away from the system, the human fleet held formation above Castle Reach, standing guard over a world that had expected to fall just hours earlier. Down in the command bunker, the young communications officer kept replaying Grace Holloway's message, still struggling to fully believe it was real. News of the battle spread across the galaxy within a single day, moving faster than any official assembly announcement ever could. Reports varied wildly at first, some calling it a miracle, others calling it a rumor too strange to be true. But the sensor recordings from Castle Reach's own defense platforms left little room for doubt. Humanity had returned to the galaxy, not quietly, not asking permission, and not the way anyone had expected after 100 years of silence. They had come back exactly the way they left, on their own terms entirely. Every screen across the assembly capital showed the same footage on repeat, grainy sensor recordings of unfamiliar warships tearing through a Dominion fleet in a matter of hours. By the second day, the footage needed no explanation anymore. Every species in assembly space already knew exactly who those ships belonged to, even if most of them had never expected to see proof of it in their lifetime. Inside the assembly core, the Great Hall was filled again, just as it had been on the day of the vote decades earlier. This time, no one celebrated. No one cheered. The room sat in tense, uncertain silence, waiting for a single ship to arrive that had been granted special permission to dock at the capital for the first time in over 100 years. Ambassador Leora Doran stood near the front of the chamber, watching the main doors with an expression somewhere between relief and nervous anticipation. She had spent decades quietly believing humanity might still exist somewhere, and now that belief had been proven true in the most dramatic way possible. Beside her, Counselor Ren Aldis stood stiffly, his usual confident posture noticeably absent. He had spent years using humanity's disappearance as proof of his own wisdom, and now the very species he had voted to remove had just saved an assembly world from total conquest. The chamber doors opened, and Admiral Grace Holloway walked in, flanked by a small honor guard that included Captain Daniel Osei. She looked exactly as calm as she had on the day she left, though her hair had gone fully gray and new lines marked her face. She walked to the center of the floor, the same spot she had stood on the day the assembly voted her species out, and waited. Ren Aldous stepped forward first, clearing his throat before speaking. "Admiral Holloway," he said, his voice carrying less confidence than it once had. "On behalf of the assembly, we owe you an explanation and likely an apology." "You don't owe us an apology," Grace said simply. "You made a decision based on fear of what you didn't understand. We made a decision to stop trying to convince people who didn't want to understand us. Neither choice was wrong exactly. They were just choices." A murmur spread through the crowd at her calm response. Ren seemed unsure how to continue, clearly having expected either anger or forgiveness, not the plain acceptance Grace offered instead. Leora Doran stepped forward next, addressing Grace directly. "The Dominion won't stop after one defeat," she said. "They'll regroup, and they'll come back stronger, possibly against other worlds first. The Assembly needs allies who can actually stand against them. Real allies, not just trade partners." Grace nodded slowly. "We didn't build our fleet to fight the Dominion specifically," she said. "We built it because we knew that eventually something would threaten this galaxy that the rest of you weren't prepared for. We just didn't know what shape that threat would take." "Does that mean you'll help us?" Leora asked directly. Grace looked around the chamber, at faces that ranged from hopeful to still openly distrustful. "We'll help," she said, "but not the way we did before. Not as a member species trying to prove we belong. As equals, standing beside you because we choose to, not because we're asking permission to exist here." The hall fell into quiet discussion, different species murmuring among themselves. Some seemed relieved, others clearly uncomfortable with the idea of humanity holding real military strength once again. Ren Aldous studied Grace for a long moment before finally speaking again. "The Assembly formally requests an alliance with humanity," he said, the words clearly difficult for him after everything he had once believed. "Full military cooperation against the Dominion threat, and beyond it if needed." Grace considered the offer, glancing briefly toward Daniel Osei, standing among her honor guard. He gave the smallest nod, silent support for whatever decision she made next. "We accept," Grace said finally, "on the condition that this alliance is permanent and equal. No future vote removes us again simply because we make people uncomfortable." Ren hesitated only a moment before agreeing, and the chamber broke into scattered applause, quieter and far more uncertain than the celebrations that had followed humanity's departure decades earlier, but genuine all the same. In the weeks that followed, human ships began appearing openly across Assembly space for the first time in over a century, working alongside Assembly fleets to reinforce border worlds and push back Dominion advances. Warlord Guruk, forced to rethink strategies that had worked flawlessly for years, found his conquests slowing for the first time since his campaign began. Back at the cradle, the hidden shipyards that had once operated in complete secrecy now stood as one node among many in a growing network stretching across the galaxy. Daniel Osei, now serving as a senior fleet captain working directly alongside Assembly officers, often thought back to the stories Elder Simeon Voss used to tell the children of the colony, stories about a vote that pushed humanity away and a promise that they would return only on their own terms. Simeon himself, now very old, lived long enough to see human ships welcomed openly into Assembly ports, something he had once told the children might never actually happen in his lifetime. "Did we win?" a young officer once asked Daniel after a difficult campaign against Dominion forces. Daniel thought about the question carefully before answering. "We didn't come back to win anything," he said. "We came back because the galaxy needed something it once decided it didn't want. This time, we get to decide how we fit into it." Behind him, the shipyards of the cradle continued their steady work, no longer hidden, no longer secret, standing openly now as proof that a species once celebrated for disappearing had never truly been gone at all. They had simply been waiting for a galaxy ready to see them clearly.